Adam, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. I'm Brian Beyer, CEO and one of the founders here at Red Canary, and I'm joined by Adina Bodkins, our threat hunting manager, who's going to talk a little bit more about one of the threats we've seen and how it relates later today. I'm incredibly excited to share more about something very special we've been working on to help teams like yours be more confident and prepared for a stressful security situation. So let's dive right in by talking about one of these situations. I'd like you to think about the most sensitive data in your company. It might be your internal intellectual property. It might be your customers' data. I'll actually pop up a poll question here so we can get interactive right from the start. It might be your employees' data, might be financial information or health data. Right? Think about the type of data that if it were to get out into the world or if somebody held it hostage, might be most damaging to you, or it might keep you up most at night. So I'll pop forward here. Let's see what everyone's answers is. We have a lot of thoughts about intellectual property, right? So with that idea in your mind about what that data might look like, it's Friday at 4 p.m. because it's always Friday at 4 p.m. when something like this happens. And you see a tweet that says the bad guys got access to that data. And let's say they show you some proof of life. So you really know you can jump ahead and know, yeah, okay, they got access to that really sensitive information. And for $100,000, they say that they won't release it. And so I want to ask you, do you pay that? Do you know how you would pay it? Do you know if you can pay it without violating SEC requirements or other rules? What if the number is not $100,000? What if it's $1 million? What if it's 5 million? Do you know how you would communicate that internally, what decision you've made? Because there's people in your company who also are on Twitter and see it. Do you know how you'd communicate about this situation to your board? Do you know how you'd communicate externally? You know, in this example, it's one simple situation with a pretty simple decision to make that every security team should be ready for, because a lot of teams have had to make this type of decision over the last several years. And this is just one of those situations, but there are thousands of these that teams should be ready for. And so what we're announcing is that we've built this readiness exercises experience so you can practice for real world situations like this every single week. So let's talk a little bit about how do security teams normally practice? Because practice is how we get ready. Practice is how we increase our readiness. Well, one way we do it is teams conduct tabletops. We normally get a bunch of folks in a room, and then we walk through a scenario. It's oftentimes the one time per year that your security leaders get the CFO, the general counsel, maybe their marketing or communications team, and sometimes even their CEO in the room. So when you get everyone in there, it's a great experience, right? No, they can be pretty boring. There are some slides. We spend a bunch of time finding out what part of our incident response process we're not very good at. That's what I normally find when I attend these. And I would describe it as it's normally the bookends that are the struggle. You see, most security teams are really good at the middle part, where you investigate the actual security incident and you're looking through the logs, you're investigating what the adversary may have done. But the beginning part, where you have to declare the incident and figure out what the severity is and get the right people together, that part we don't practice very much. And then we have the end part, where we have to make really hard business affecting decisions. Do I pay a large amount of money in a ransom? Do I turn off the company's SaaS website because something might be exfiltrated? You know, where we have to figure out, how do I communicate internally and externally? We don't practice that very often either. And then how often do we practice with these tabletops? Well, one thing we know is that it's not very often. A SANS survey reported that less than 50% of organizations conducted a tabletop at least once per year, and less than 30% did at least 2 per year. So it's not always the best experience, and we don't do it very often. So it's not exactly great practice. The other way security teams practice is they send their team to training courses. These courses are great. They teach you how adversaries work, they give you this great lab environment, and they show you how you can detect and investigate those adversaries. They're great. But the problem is, our environments aren't lab environments. In a lab, you know every AWS account you're protecting, and every endpoint has logging or EDR installed. But in the real world, our engineers create new cloud accounts and they don't tell us about them. And then the bad guys get in there and they start crypto mining. And how much does the training cost? Well, these days it can be almost $10,000 for each training course and the travel and hotels to get someone there. And so we know that's not in everybody's budget anymore. So training doesn't always work great for us because I don't just need a few members of my team trained. I need everybody to be trained. So then there's a third way that a lot of security teams practice, and that's atomic tests. So many years ago, we were working with many of you, and it was clear that testing your security tools and processes was just too hard. So we got together with some others in the community. We created Atomic Red Team because we wanted to make it possible for every team to very simply test their defenses. You can visit a web page, you could copy a command, and you can run it. And it changed everything. Now tens of thousands of people have run an atomic test. Dozens of breach and attack simulation tools have been built that leverage Atomic Red Team. And we have this amazing community of maintainers spearheaded by Carrie Roberts and some Red Canary folks that keep adding more and growing that catalog. And over the years, here's what we kept hearing from people who ran these tests. They'd ask, where do I start? Or they'd say, how do I put more structure around my testing? How am I supposed to keep track of what tests worked well and what didn't? What didn't work? How do I actually improve over time? So if we take these three different ways that security teams are practicing and we put together a little diagram with the easy versus hard axis, and then the axis for how realistic is that practice versus how academic it is, I think our tabletops are over here on the left. They can be pretty hard because a lot of them are expensive. Some organizations are paying tens of thousands of dollars for a couple hour-long facilitated exercise. And they also tend to be pretty hard because they take a lot of time and coordination with so many people. But they're in the middle on realism. It really depends on who's putting them together and how well they're facilitated. Some of them are really pretty good, and they mix in something recently that's happened at your organization, maybe top threats that your board or your CEO is worried about. But some of them are this awkwardly strung together chain of unrelated situations that really isn't like anything you'd encounter in the real world. Then we have our training courses. They're definitely easier because they're cheaper and they involve less people. But they can get pretty academic with the labs and the situations that might not have anything to do with your real world environment, your cloud, your user and identity systems, your SIM, your logging. Or, some of this training is filled with all these multiple choice questions. As someone who's taken a lot of multiple choice tests, what's great about multiple choice questions? They're easy. But that's not how the real world works. Incident response isn't a bunch of multiple choice questions. It's real life. It's very free form. It's harder. So then third, we have our atomic tests. They're really easy to get started, but they're not so easy to scale and keep track of what you tested and what your teammates tested, what happened, where you need to improve, if something has changed over time. And so if we want people to be practicing frequently, ideally once a week, we want realistic and easy. What we want to do is make something so realistic and easy to use that you and the folks on your team want to keep coming back and practicing to increase your readiness. That's what readiness exercises is. So we're going to bring these three experiences together for teams. Readiness exercises unifies how you can do tabletops, training, and atomic tests. Now, to make this readiness realistic and easy, we're going to start with realistic real-world scenarios. These scenarios are the result of our team conducting over 1 million investigations each year and finding tens of thousands of real threats that we do for nearly 1,000 customers through our managed detection and response offering. We see so many threats, and because of that, we have a pretty good idea how to help teams practice. So these real-world scenarios are going to take you through various parts of responding to real-world situations. Some of them are mapped to the top threats affecting organizations today. We know what those top threats are because every year we publish a comprehensive threat detection report that summarizes what we've seen. You can see we have QBot, Impacket, Ad Search, Bootloader, and the list goes on. These are the threats that are affecting most organizations. We've also aligned some of these scenarios with the top attack techniques when you want to get ready for more specific adversary behavior. We know that from an attack perspective, these 10 techniques are the ones adversaries are most likely to use against you. So we're going to give you extra scenarios around those techniques so you're ready for what matters. So these scenarios are going to get you into realistic situations and get you discussing the really interesting stuff. So in this example situation you see here on the right, when you see gigabytes of data being exfiltrated, what do? Now we're going to prompt you to talk about, hey, what is your detection and response process when data is being exfiltrated? What tools do you have? What processes do you have? Does your team know where you'd go to look? And then we're going to ask you, hey, what detective or preventative controls do you have in place if you want to block that exfiltration? Do you know if you see this data leaving your organization, how you would actually stop it? Is it something where you have to put in an IT ticket and maybe wait for up to 12 hours until they make a firewall rule change or update one of your systems? Or is it something that your security team can really, truly action on in the heat of the moment? So exercising a realistic scenario is good. And these scenarios are going to range from things that affect and involve your communications team, your security operations team, your leadership team. You have a lot of choices there. But we don't just want a good exercise. We want something great. We want great practice. And when we go practice something, we don't just do the activity. We do the activity and then we retrospect it. My background, I come from the software engineering world, and inside of software engineering, we have a lot of Agile, and we have these principles called Scrum. And I was taught through Scrum training that every time we would go complete a sprint or we would complete these big units of work, we would conduct a retrospective. And we'd ask two simple questions. What went well and what didn't? So when we conduct one of these scenario exercises, if we want to improve, we're going to run our scenario, and then we're going to ask these two questions. Now, there's a couple different ways we can ask these questions. If you're running a scenario by yourself, maybe it's lunchtime and you want to practice for a specific attack technique, you can ask yourself these questions. If you're running a scenario with your team, maybe it's part of a weekly Tabletop Tuesdays that you're doing and you're conducting something a little more elaborate, you retrospect as a team and you really look at, hey, how do we work together as a team? What went well? What could we improve about how we work together? And if you have Red Canary facilitate the exercise for you, we'll conduct that retrospective and we'll give you feedback. So you have that feedback from an external party. So every time you run a scenario, we're going to ask you afterward to jot down your retrospective notes. And this retrospective is key to us really getting better. And those notes are great. They're going to give us something we can look back at. The platform is going to keep track of your notes and your retrospective on all these skills that you conduct over time. And so you can see, sort of how you answered these questions before and kind of build up a catalog of knowledge there. But we want more than just to feel like we're getting better. We want a more quantitative assessment. And so to assess the maturity of our response during this scenario, we're going to have you assess that maturity using the COBIT framework. So this framework gives us a simple way to assess the maturity of something we do, whether it's just any simple process or even maybe a really complicated process. It's a framework that also happens to be used by a lot of auditors. So it's easy for you to generate a report for your auditors to show how mature you are in these areas and how that improves over time. All right, so we know we can pick from these realistic scenarios to exercise. We know that when we're done, we're going to retrospect it. We're going to assess how mature our response was. And then there's one more thing for us to really practice and improve our readiness. And that is, we need to record our to-dos and our action items, right? Because if you've conducted these tabletops and these trainings and exercises before, how many times have you done that where you then get a report at the end with recommendations in it? And if it was a great report, it's going to tell you, here are the things you really should do to get better. But then what happens to those to-dos or those action items? They live in that PDF or that Word document. And then that PDF gets closed and forgotten. So we never get better. And so it's just a huge wasted opportunity. And so what we're going to do is we're going to unify your simple post-scenario exercise to-do tracking inside of Red Canary to make it easy for you to remember what you need to do. And then, my favorite part, give you that glorious feeling that comes from checking something off your to-do list. And so when you go conduct an exercise, whether it's during the exercise when you notice, hey, there's something we should do to improve, you can jot down a to-do. When you're conducting your retrospective, you can say, hey, we realize we need to do X, Y, or Z on that front, or we need to talk to so-and-so or improve this process. You can jot down a to-do. If you have Red Canary facilitate one of these exercises for you, we'll jot down some to-dos that we're going to recommend for you to do. And all of that completes the loop of being able to practice in a way where we practice, we then retrospect and ask ourselves what we did well and what we can do better. And then we take our to-dos and our notes so that we write down what's most important to improve so we can check them off the list. All right, now enough talking. Let's show you how you can use it. We talked earlier about a ransom scenario that we'd exercise probably with your finance, legal, security leader, and comms teams. So now let's talk about more of a security operations scenario. The number one most frequently observed threat over the last 12 months, which is Qbot. So I want to introduce Adina Bodkins, who leads one of our threat hunting teams, who's going to teach us more about Qbot and then guide us through that exercise.
Hey. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the history of Qbot before we dive into how it works and then how to get ready for it. So Qbot started in 2007, or was seen as early as 2007, so almost 15 years old, and started as a banking Trojan, targeting American companies looking for banking credentials, user data. But over the years, it's kind of worked with other threats. So we've seen it collaborate and work with Emotet, TrickBot, and obviously everyone's favorite, various ransomware groups. And so it's typically delivered via email. And in 2022, we saw that the Qbot affiliates, they experimented with delivering various file types, probably in response to additional security controls that Microsoft put in place throughout the year. So they're adapting. They're still, very prevalent and seen throughout the security world. How does it work? So they start off by sending an email. So this is going to be various file types. And then they've also started to deliver via disk images. So these are ISO images, so they can bypass some security controls. They get the user to run a file. So they'll have a script file run. It'll call out to a C2, which will then download the malicious DLL. It'll do establish persistence, and then it'll have the follow-on activity, which could be ransomware, loosening remote admin tools, and remote access tools. So less talking about Qbot and more showing. So Brian, let's start with the exercise. And how this is going to work is you'll drive the exercise and be the scribe, and I'll talk through what the team would be doing during the exercise. Okay, so with Qbot, we have a few different scenarios that we can pick from. We have a 60-minute one that covers all the various delivery methods and techniques that it uses. But for today's demo, we want to focus on a small snack-sized scenario that you can just run during lunch. And so this scenario specifically focuses on Qbot delivering a phishing email with a malicious zip file. That file contains an LNK file that will run PowerShell to download and execute the Qbot DLL. So let's set up the exercise. Brian, if you can put me in the security operations role, and then you get the exciting other role.
All right, we're set.
Let's begin. So before we can actually run this exercise, right, we need to prepare our environment. It's very important to make sure that you have permission to test, that you have a test machine so that you can easily differentiate in your logs where is this activity coming from, and that you configure Atomic Red Team and invoke Atomic to be able to easily run the Atomic tests. So we're going to start off with the Qbot, with the exercise. So this Atomic Red Team test, this command here, invoke Atomic, will mimic the behavior of a zip file containing an LNK file. It'll run PowerShell, and instead of executing and downloading a malicious DLL, it'll just execute PuTTY, an SSH tool. And then we need to do a little observe, detect, and mitigate loop to see how did we do, right? So we need to answer the question about, did we see the activity? Did we log this adversary behavior? Did our security teams detect it, and could we have prevented it? And you can see that the hints on the little hints here point us to where we would want to look so we can see this behavior. So if I was doing this at Red Canary, we'd be looking at our EDR tool, our SIM, our DNS proxy logs. So bad news, Brian. We looked at our DNS proxy logs. We saw evidence of the network traffic, but we didn't see anything on the endpoint. And so what we found out is that this endpoint didn't have our EDR product on it. So when we have our test machine, we want to make sure that has the same security tools and controls that all of our other corporate machines have. However, we also saw that we don't have any sysmon or Windows event logging enabled across our environment. So we really have no visibility of what's occurring on the endpoint. So normally we would keep going, walk through the detection, the mitigation, but we don't really have time for that right now. So we can just complete this exercise and start the retrospective. And Brian, since I facilitated this exercise, can you do the retrospective?
All right, will do. So if we come down here, we're going to say, let's begin our retrospective and look at our answer here. So we didn't say we observed or logged that behavior. I'd say the retrospective notes on here are, we really need to ensure we have EDR and Windows event logging and sysmon installed on these systems. Very important to have this visibility. Then when I think about our maturity level here, we did achieve our purpose. So more or less, because you said we saw some of this in the DNS proxy logs, feel like this is a solid maturity level number one. It was incomplete. It was unorganized. We didn't have complete visibility on there like we expected. So let's say that's a level one here. So now, again, if we were spending a full 20 minutes doing this, we would go provide some retrospective feedback around the detection step that we'd expect here, as well as the mitigation step. In this case, we're just going to complete the retrospective. And we can see, in large part, because we only answered one question, and in that question, we only had a maturity level of 1, our scenario readiness, like how ready are we for this scenario? Well, we round down to a solid 0 here because we didn't complete most of that exercise. And we ended up with such low scores on that. So this would definitely indicate to me we need more practice around responding to this first part of Qbot because it didn't go very cleanly the first time. One other thing we note as coming from this is we have a to-do here. We need to install not install, we need to configure Windows event logging and sysmon on our test endpoint. And that one seems like a pretty big deal that we didn't have this, so let's make sure that's high priority. And Adina, I have no idea how I would do that, so that's going to be your responsibility to go do that there. That brings us to the end of the demo. And so with this, you saw that's it. It's that easy to run an exercise. I'm trying to bring together here tabletops, training, and atomic tests. As you saw, these real world scenarios, they can range from 20 minutes that you can go do during lunch to full on 120-minute long tabletop exercises. You can improve your readiness in two different ways. You can do it on demand with access to the platform here, with any amount of your team being able to jump in, run these different types of scenarios, whether they are incident response or comms or bring together your leadership team. Or you can have Red Canary come in and facilitate your next tabletop and see how much more engaging and realistic that is compared to how you've done it in the past. So really appreciate you all joining us today. With that, I'll answer a few questions that you all have posted before we wrap for the day. Let me jump over here to the Q&A section. All right, one question that I see here is there a way to show any proof of completion for compliance? There are a couple different ways. So there is sort of two main ways built into the platform for reporting. One of them is that for every exercise that has been completed, you can generate a report out of that. And what it will highlight is some basic summary information about the exercise. And then it will show all of the notes from the retrospective, and it will show how you performed on each of the skills underneath here. Something that you'll note for all the security operations scenarios, the underlying skills are mapped to the CISA incident response phases. And so you can see for each phase of incident response, here was your team's maturity and response. You'll also see a list in that report of which skills had the lowest maturity and are places that you really should focus on in order to improve your readiness. So those reports you can download as a PDF. You can send them to your auditor. Like we talked about, everything is mapped to COBIT. And so if that's the language that you speak with your auditors, it should feel right at home for them. All right, another question here around what is the pricing and licensing model? One thing that's been important for us is we want to make this as easy as possible for you to get as many people in your organization involved as you can. So the pricing model here, there are effectively sort of three different categories or tiers of features based on how much reporting and goal setting you need versus a much simpler sort of starter tier. All of those right now give unlimited access to any number of users into them, because what's really important for us is we get as much of your team as possible into the platform and conducting exercises today. Another question here, is there a tabletop or test for 0-day attacks and follow-up lesson learned in that scenario? So that's an awesome question. I'll tell you what I've learned from our security team over the last 9 or 10 years that we've been doing this. One thing that we've consistently seen is that the types of security incidents that end up resulting in breaches tend not to be 0 days. They tend not to be something completely new and bespoke someone has never seen before. And so our security team's recommendation has been really to practice the basics, practice the things. If I can jump back here into these techniques, for example, these are the techniques you really want to be practicing against most, because most likely it's not some esoteric 0-day that's going to get you breached. It is someone using, according to this, a Windows command shell, PowerShell, WMI, obfuscated files, run DLL. It's an adversary using these techniques that is most likely to cause you problems. And so one of our focuses, and something we've done a lot with the attack team, is trying to take this entire ocean of all of these attack techniques across enterprise and cloud and ways people might misuse identities and really help everybody understand where to start. Because it's more important that we really, get great at the basics and the fundamentals and, the equivalent of eating our vegetables every day, and be really good at detecting, observing, and mitigating these top techniques. We have a question here around, is there anything around Mac OS, Linux, AWS, or Kubernetes? Awesome question. Our goal with this, so yes, there is. There are scenarios that will focus on a variety of operating systems and what real threats look like in those places, whether they are sort of inside your corporate environment or potentially could be inside your cloud environment or your users as they use other SaaS applications. There are also scenarios that go outside of the security operations domain. One thing as a CEO that I spend a lot of time thinking about is less the actual security operations to one of those incidents, but more the communications piece. How do I think about how we would communicate something that goes wrong in a security perspective? How do I figure out how would I communicate to my board? And so one thing you'll see from us is we don't want this to just be focused on the middle security operations piece of an incident response. We really want to help teams get good at practicing their preparation and how they declare an incident and how they assign an incident severity and bring the right team together. And then we really want to help teams practice how do you make the hard business affecting decisions and how do you do the right communications there. One last question here before we break. How often do we recommend users keep their runbooks and playbooks up to date? That's a great question. I'll tell you where I would start. Where I would start is let's make sure we have our playbooks and our runbooks and how we'd actually respond here. Let's try and start by making sure we have them written down in a place that the team knows where to find them. It's actually been one of the things for all of the early access users who we've used this platform with. It's been one of their biggest requested features is that not only do we help teams practice, but we store some of that information for them. There's one skill in here from an incident response perspective that I thought was really interesting as the team was developing this. And it was this question that you'd ask a team that says, do you know how you would prevent DNS resolution for an adversary domain? And what's really interesting about that question is it seems like it's pretty straightforward. But then when you really get into it, you find out, well, wait, DNS resolution works one way in this corporate office. It works a different way for my work from home users. It works a different way in my AWS cloud and yet a different way inside my Azure cloud. And that's a lot of different variations. And most security teams have never really written that down, and they don't have an easy way to say, oh yeah, that's right. I have this architecture diagram or I have these notes that say, if it's in this part of my cloud, here's how I block DNS resolution for that domain. And so one of the things we want to do is we want to make it possible for everyone to be able to very simply record how do they respond in those cases and make it so that when something does go wrong and you are in the middle of an incident, it's really easy to recall that information and to be able to respond quickly and how you expected you would. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for all of the great questions. This is something I'm really excited about as a way that we can help every security team feel more confident and ready in case something does go wrong. As Adam mentioned, there's a lot of resources out there. Feel free to reach out if we can share more, if you'd like to see a demo or want to learn more about what types of threats or techniques using the Red Canary Threat Detection Report based on all the research we've done. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see you all. We look forward to seeing you out there.